In today's episode, we are looking at what sex was like in medieval times. The missionary was the only legal position. The only making love position approved by the church was missionary. Given that intimacy was merely viewed as a method of procreation, they believed that missionary was the only viable option because other positions could confuse gender roles or accentuate the pleasure components of the act. In fact, the church's most progressive move at the time was to categorize various positions based on their levels of sin. The more enticing the position, the steeper your ascension to hell. Intimacy before marriage was death. Making love before marriage was strictly forbidden. It still is for most religions and cultures today. The church had a sort of SWAT team that would sneak up behind you and handcuff you while performing the act. If you were caught making love prior to marriage, you would have been disemboweled. You were doomed for life if you had erectile dysfunction. You couldn't just tell your wife you'd had a long day at work back then. If you were having difficulty getting that boy up, you were doomed. Erectile dysfunction can now be treated thanks to medical advances. However, if you had this problem in the past, the church would send its top medical professionals to your home to thoroughly examine your item. If you improved, great; if not, your marriage was over and your chances of ever getting laid were gone. Condoms were made from either the parts of animals or cloth. Given that the church still considers the use of condoms to be a sin, the existence of historical records of their use at such an early date is astounding. I'm sure they were dealing with more serious issues back then. Condoms were originally intended to protect people from contracting STDs more than anything else, and they could be made out of anything, from animal bladders or intestines to linen. Bread loaves made the best dildos. Even though self-pleasure was considered a sin, people found ways to satisfy themselves. Wooden dildos were already popular, but who could afford them? As a result, women resorted to the next best option: hardened loaves of bread. The majority of women baked loaves of bread until they were hard enough to be used as dildos. Virginity was a woman's pride. Back in the day, virginity was pretty much the gold standard for judging a woman. Women who had lost their virginity were regarded as less pure than those who had remained celibate. Even losing their virginity after marriage required compensation in the form of a gift. The husband would have to give his wife a decent present in exchange for taking away the one thing she held dear. You weren't supposed to enjoy making love. In those days, having intimate relations was considered not only wrong, but also a necessary evil in order to procreate. This meant that you could make love if you needed to, but you were not supposed to enjoy it, and doing it solely for the sake of pleasure was considered a sin. Praying hard would get women their virginity back. Going back to virginity as the only badge of honor, women who lost their virginity, even if due to marriage, could serve penance and pray for the rest of their lives to regain it. Of course, nothing changed physically, but from a religious standpoint, women could achieve higher levels of divinity if they prayed to regain their virginity. Gay life was tough. Even today, we all know how the church views homosexuality. It was even worse during the medieval period. If it was discovered that a member of the community was gay, they were severely punished. Gays had to flee for their lives. Too much desire was a feminine trait. In the Middle Ages, intense love-making desire was regarded as a particularly feminine trait. Women were thought to be insatiable and constantly on the lookout for new experiences, employing feminine cunning to entice men to sleep with them. Women were thought to act more on their animalistic urges because they were supposedly weak-minded and more susceptible to emotion, and as daughters of Eve, they were deemed inherently sinful. Men, on the other hand, were thought to be more rational and holy than women, and thus more capable of resisting temptation. Men who were openly too interested in getting laid were viewed as more feminized. Priests were permitted to marry. The church did not begin to require its priests to live a celibate life until the late 11th century. Prior to this change, priests were permitted to marry and were expected to raise their sons to become priests as well. Nonetheless, the Eucharist had become an increasingly holy ritual by this point in time. The idea that priests could have sexual relations with their wives and then touch the altar, or the sacrament, was not well received by those in positions of authority in the Christian church. People were pretty cool with brothels. Prostitutes were popular in the Middle Ages, despite the widespread belief that intimacy was sinful. Overall, prostitution was regarded as a fairly honest and important profession. For a time, the church tolerated prostitutes. Of course, independent prostitutes were scorned. However, if you were a member of a brothel, you were a productive member of society.